In 1957, a Harvard physiologist named Kurt Richter placed wild rats in a tank of water. Without any prior experience of rescue, they drowned, most within 15 minutes. Then he changed one variable. He held each rat briefly in his hands, let it feel solid ground, then placed it back in the water. The same rat swam for 60 hours. Same body, same brain, same water. The only thing that changed was one experience, the experience of being held, of ground existing, of escape being possible. And that single experience rewired everything. Right now, according to the World Health Organization, more than 1 billion people on this planet are living with a mental health disorder. 1 billion people in survival mode, managing, enduring. Not broken, but not free either. And that raises a question most of us have never been taught to ask. Is surviving enough? Or is there a difference between simply staying afloat and actually building a life that is richer, deeper, and more alive than the one you had before the hardship arrived? Today, we are going to answer that question with science, and the answer is going to be more surprising and more actionable than you expect. The rats that survived were not the strongest. They were the ones whose brains had received one piece of information, that the situation was not permanent. That action could produce a different outcome. Most of us are living inside our own version of that tank, not in crisis, functional, capable, getting through the days, but operating from a quiet assumption that this, what we have right now, is roughly what is available to us. Psychologist Corey Keyes found that in a representative sample of over 3,000 American adults, only 17% met criteria for full flourishing. The overwhelming majority were somewhere in the middle, managing but not fully built. That is the gap this video is about, because it turns out that some people, after the hardest experiences of their lives, do not just recover, they come out the other side transformed, more capable, more connected, more purposeful than they were before. The science has spent 30 years studying exactly how that happens, and what it has found is that it is not luck. It is a process, a specific, identifiable, learnable process. Here is what you are going to leave this video with. Tool 1 is called the Positive Appraisal Practice. It is grounded in a major longitudinal resilience study conducted at the University of Mainz by Professor Raphael Kalisch, and it targets a specific cognitive circuit in your prefrontal cortex that the research identifies as the single strongest predictor of who stays mentally healthy under sustained stress. 5 minutes, a notebook, 2 questions. That is all it takes to begin training that circuit tonight. Tool 2 is the control sequence. It comes directly from a 2016 paper by Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer, the same researchers who discovered learned helplessness 50 years earlier, in which they overturned their own theory. What they found will change how you think about every moment you feel stuck, overwhelmed, or powerless, and the practice they point to takes less than 10 minutes. Tool 3 is the deliberate integration practice. This is the one that separates people who are merely changed by adversity from those who grow from it. It is drawn from 30 years of post-traumatic growth research across 87 studies and nearly 15,000 survivors. But I want to be honest with you about what the science actually shows. This is not a practice that works overnight. The research suggests that meaningful integration takes time, often more than 2 years, and in the early stages, it can coexist with more painful intrusive thoughts, not fewer. This is not a warning, it is good science, because it means that if you are still hurting while you do this practice, you are not doing it wrong. You are inside the process. 3 tools, all evidence-based, all actionable today, but built for the long game, not for a quick fix. If you close this video before the tools, you will have heard a story without its ending. So stay with me. January 29th, 1954, Kosciuszko, Mississippi. A girl is born to 2 teenagers who will not stay together. She is sent to live on her grandmother's farm. A woman of deep religious conviction and harsh discipline, who, as Oprah would later write, beat her for the slightest reasons, spilled water, a broken glass, the inability to keep quiet or still. The long-term impact, she said, turned me into a world-class people-pleaser for most of my life. At 6, she has moved to her mother's home in Milwaukee. She sleeps on the porch. What followed were years of experiences entirely outside her control. She told no one, because she had learned at the most fundamental neurological level what Martin Seligman would later call learned helplessness, that what you do does not change what happens to you, that action is futile, that the correct response to pain is silence and stillness. At 13, she runs away. At 14, a child, she gives birth to a premature baby boy who dies within weeks of being born. She names him later, privately, Canaan. Because Canaan means new land, new life. What happens next is not inspiration, it is neuroscience. Her father, Vernon, takes her in. He is structured and demanding. He requires reading. He enforces expectations. He sends her to speech competitions and oratory contests. These are not grand interventions. They are small sequences. Do this. Something changes. Do this again. Each one is firing a circuit in her brain that years of uncontrollable experience had systematically silenced. The prefrontal cortex's capacity to believe that action produces outcome, that agency exists, that the next thing she does might matter. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal neurological mechanism that Seligman and Meyer would identify 50 years into their research, and it is working in Oprah's brain, in Nashville, in the late 1960s, through speech competitions and library books. She wins the competitions. She gets a radio job at 17. At 19, she becomes Nashville's first black female news anchor. She is fired from her first anchor job in Baltimore, told she is too emotional for television. She does not suppress the emotion. She does not harden against it. She finds a format where emotion is not a liability, but the entire point. She takes over a struggling Chicago morning show, and within a year, it is the highest-rated program of its kind in the city. In 1986, The Oprah Winfrey Show goes national. It runs for 25 years. Over those 25 years, she tapes 217 episodes dedicated specifically to sexual abuse, converting her most private wound into the world's most watched public conversation about trauma and healing. She would say, "It is because I was sexually abused, raped, that I have such empathy for people who've experienced that. It has given me a broader understanding and a deeper appreciation for every little and big thing I now have." Stop and sit with what just happened in that sentence. She is not saying her trauma was acceptable. She is not saying she is grateful it happened. She is saying something far more precise and far more scientifically interesting. That who she became, the depth of her understanding, the quality of her empathy, The specific instrument of connection she brought to millions of people could not have been built any other way. This is not resilience in the ordinary sense. Resilience would have meant recovering, returning to a baseline that for Oprah had never been safe. What her story demonstrates is what psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, after 3 decades of research, call post-traumatic growth. Transformation not back to who you were, but forward into someone the adversity made possible. New possibilities, personal strength discovered under pressure, relationships of greater depth and authenticity, a changed understanding of what life is actually for. The girl beaten into silence became the woman who gave millions of people permission to speak, and the research tells us that is not luck, and it is not exceptional. It is a process, and that process is what we are about to map. So let us map it. What Oprah's story demonstrates, what the science has spent 30 years documenting, breaks down into 4 interlocking pieces. Each one builds on the last. Together they form a complete picture of what actually separates the people who merely survive their hardship from the people who are transformed by it. The first piece is the spectrum, where resilience ends and growth begins. The second is the mechanism, why adversity under the right conditions becomes a doorway rather than a wall. The third is the neuroscience, what is literally happening inside the brain when agency is lost and how it is rebuilt. And the fourth is the goal itself, what flourishing actually means and why getting there requires more than simply not being broken. 4 pieces. Let us take them one at a time. 1. The spectrum, from surviving to flourishing. George Bonanno's landmark review of 54 studies showed that the most common response to major trauma is a stable trajectory of healthy functioning. Most people are resilient. Resilience is the human default, but he called it minimal impact resilience, a return to baseline, like a rubber band, stretched under pressure, then released, back to exactly the shape it was before. That is genuinely healthy. But it is not the ceiling. A bone that breaks and heals correctly comes back denser at the fracture point. Post-traumatic growth is the bone model. 2. The mechanism, why adversity can become the doorway. Tedeschi and Calhoun identified the core mechanism of post-traumatic growth, the shattering of the assumptive world. Major adversity invalidates our deep beliefs about how life works. The scaffolding falls, and the person is left in profound cognitive disequilibrium. Here is where the fork in the road appears. In the aftermath of trauma, there are 2 very different kinds of mental activity. Intrusive rumination, the looping, uncontrolled cycling of distressing thoughts, strongly associated with depression and worse long-term outcomes. Deliberate meaning-making, purposeful, self-directed engagement, actively asking, what does this mean? Crystal Park's integrative review showed this is the central engine of psychological adaptation after loss. Taku and her collaborators confirmed across US and Japanese samples that deliberate meaning-making, not intrusive rumination, most strongly predicts post-traumatic growth. The difference is not in what you are thinking about. It is in who is driving. Intrusive rumination happens to you. Deliberate meaning-making is something you do. And Helgeson, Reynolds, and Tomich's meta-analysis, 87 studies, nearly 15,000 participants, confirmed something critical. Post-traumatic growth and ongoing distress run as parallel processes, not sequential ones. You do not have to finish grieving before you start growing. If you are still in the middle of something hard, you are not disqualified. You are potentially already inside the process. 3. The neuroscience. Why your brain defaults to passivity. In 1967, Seligman and Meyer placed 3 groups of dogs in harnesses with electric shocks. Group 1 could stop the shocks by pressing a panel. Group 2 received identical shocks with no control. Group 3 received no shocks. Then all 3 groups were placed in a shuttle box. 2 compartments, 1 safe, separated by a low barrier. Groups 1 and 3 jumped immediately. Group 2 lay down and accepted the shocks, even though escape was right there. Seligman called it learned helplessness, one of the most replicated findings in psychology. But here is the plot twist that arrived 50 years later. In 2016, Seligman and Meyer returned to this research and overturned their own conclusion. Helplessness, they found, is not learned. Passivity is the brain's factory setting, built into neural circuitry, activating automatically when the brain perceives uncontrollable outcomes. What requires learning, what requires experience to build, is control. Agency. Every time the neural sequence fires, I did something and something changed. The prefrontal cortex's regulatory capacity is consolidated. The passive default is overridden incrementally with each repetition. This is why Oprah's father's seemingly small interventions were neurologically profound, and why Nelson Mandela planted a garden in a 2.5-meter cell, and why Malala Yousafzai typed blog entries under a pseudonym from a valley under occupation. The scale does not matter. The sequence does. 4. The goal. Flourishing is a state you build. Corey Keyes made a discovery that should permanently change how we think about psychological health. Mental illness and mental health are 2 entirely separate dimensions, not 2 ends of a single continuum. You can be symptom-free and still be going through the motions of a life without actually inhabiting it. In his 10-year longitudinal follow-up, people who stayed in the non-flourishing zone were 6 times more likely to develop a serious mental illness than those who were flourishing. Not being broken is not the same as being whole, and flourishing is something you build through specific, documented, evidence-based practices. Practices like the 3 tools you are about to receive. Tool 1. The positive appraisal practice. The science. Resilient people do not experience less stress. They interpret it differently. Professor Kalish's Mainz longitudinal data identifies positive appraisal style as the strongest replicable predictor of sustained mental health under stress. Neuroimaging studies show it increases prefrontal cortical activity and decreases amygdala reactivity over time. The practice, tonight, 5 minutes. Open a notebook. Answer 2 questions. Question 1. What was one difficult moment today? Write it in 1 sentence. Name it plainly. Question 2. What is one true alternative interpretation of that moment that preserves a sense of agency, however small? The word true is doing everything here. You are not looking for a silver lining. You are training your prefrontal cortex to generate alternative perspectives. Do this for 30 days. Notice not whether you feel better immediately, but whether the second question becomes easier to answer over time. That ease is the neurological change you are building toward. Tool 2. The control sequence. The science. Your brain's default response to uncontrollable stress is passivity, and the only thing that overrides that default is the repeated experience of action-producing outcome regardless of scale. The size of the action is neurologically irrelevant. The practice, right now, 10 minutes. Identify one action you can complete in the next 10 minutes that will produce a visible physical change in your immediate environment. Not a plan, not a decision. An action. Completed. Done. Clean one corner. Send one message you have been delaying. Walk around the block. What your brain requires is the sequence, the proof that the passive default is not the only option. Do this every time you feel the paralysis of overwhelm, not as a productivity hack, as a neurological intervention. Tool 3. The deliberate integration practice. The science. Post-traumatic growth does not happen automatically. It requires deliberate engagement with the meaning of adversity. Park and Taku both confirm. Deliberate meaning-making, not intrusive rumination, is what predicts growth. And the research is honest. In the early stages, this process can surface more uncomfortable thoughts, not fewer. This is not the practice failing. This is the practice working. The practice, this week, 20 minutes. Find 20 minutes of uninterrupted time. Write about the most significant difficulty in your life right now using these 4 prompts. Prompt 1. What did this experience shatter that I had previously taken for granted? Prompt 2. What has this experience forced me to learn about myself that I would not have discovered otherwise? Prompt 3. In what ways has this experience changed how I relate to other people? Prompt 4. What small new possibility exists in your life now that did not exist before? If you cannot answer it today, write, I cannot see this yet, and return in 30 days. Come back to this practice regularly, not once. The research suggests that the people who benefit most treat meaning-making as an ongoing conversation with their own experience. Oprah spent 25 years doing this publicly. You can begin tonight, alone, in 20 minutes. The process is the same. The scale is irrelevant. We started with a number. 1 billion people living with a mental health disorder. 1 billion people in survival mode. You now know why that number does not tell the whole story. Because the same research that documents the prevalence of suffering also documents something the headlines rarely report, that among the people who go through the hardest things, a meaningful subset come out not just intact, but more. Post-traumatic growth is real. Thriving beyond baseline is real. The research of Tedeschi, Calhoun, Keyes, Bonanno, Kalish, Park, and Seligman converges on a single conclusion. The goal of psychological health is not the absence of illness. It is the presence of flourishing, even in the presence of adversity. The most resilient people in the scientific literature are not the ones who avoided pain. They are the ones who, in the middle of their pain, in whatever small way was available to them, kept choosing to act. Oprah won a speech competition with no safety net and no evidence yet that it would matter. Mandela planted a garden in a cell the size of a bathroom. Malala typed a blog post under a false name from a valley that wanted her silent. None of them were waiting to feel ready. The neuroscience says they did not need to. Because the brain is rebuilt not through grand gestures, but through the repeated quiet sequence of, I did something, and something changed. You are not here to merely survive your life. The research says you were built for more than that, and now you know exactly where to start. Choose one tool, just one, and use it before you go to sleep tonight. The brain does not require a perfect choice. It requires a first move. Subscribe if you want to go deeper. Our next video asks, what does it mean to live a meaningful life? Not just a successful one, not just a happy one, but a life that feels, from the inside, like it was worth living. I will see you there.